Hello there, my name is Taylor Reed, also known as Treed, and welcome back to another Treed Reads video. Today we have a really fun one that I've been super excited to make. I had to finish one more book to make this video, but we're going to talk about it. It is the ultimate Cosmere reading order, at least in my opinion. If you're not familiar with the Cosmere, it is Brandon Sanderson's expanded universe of books. Not all of his books are in it, but a lot of them share the same universe, and they share some key attributes and even some characters. There's a lot of online discourse about where to start with the Cosmere because there are so many different options, so many different books in it. I looked at a ton of them when I started reading his books, and I made an order for myself that I ended up tweaking a bit as I went. I've just finished The Way of Kings, so I've read each entry point into the Cosmere. So here's my final tried and tested reading order for the Cosmere. Yours might be different. If you've already read these books, you might have different ideas about what should come first or go next, and that's okay. So if you're new to this, make sure you take what I say with a grain of salt. So when I first picked up Brandon Sanderson's books, I looked at this amazing chart of the reading order. This I found just by searching on the internet. It took me to Reddit, and this user, jofwu, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name, but this reading order is really comprehensive and it gives you a good idea of what goes where in the Cosmere order. You don't need to know what all these things are yet, you don't need to know how they fit together. I will guide you through this because I spent a lot of time looking at this and figuring out exactly where I want it to go. The bottom line is, I think there's one place to start, which is Mistborn. Mistborn is the story of Vin. She's a girl who lives in a place called the Final Empire. Basically, the concept for Mistborn is what if the bad guy already won? And what if there was a heist to maybe take down some of his power? Mistborn is excellent for anyone getting into the Cosmere because the setting is somewhat limited. The Final Empire is kind of condensed into one main city with some outlying lands. So it's not like you need to keep a ton of different people and species and different magic systems all in your head at one time. There is a cast with multiple characters, they're all really well developed, but everything is put forth for a fantasy book in a relatively simple fashion. One complaint that I see people make about Brandon Sanderson's work and other fantasy works in general is that there's so much jargon, so many new words, so many fantastical elements to keep in your head at one time, especially at the start. Mistborn is a very gentle introduction to fantasy. The world building is gentle, it's not like info dumping at all, and you don't need to keep that much in your head. It's also reminded constantly, like if something new happens or something happens that is magical or fantastical, there's usually an explanation, even if it's like the fourth or fifth time happening. So if I were just starting out with the Cosmere again, 100% I'd start with Mistborn 1 first. The first book is called The Final Empire, and I'd read that whole trilogy. That's The Final Empire, The Well of Ascension, and The Hero of Ages. After you finish that trilogy, there's something called Arcanum Unbounded. This is a collection of short stories that go throughout the Cosmere, different parts of the Cosmere, and they tell parts of the overall story that aren't in the main books. I would recommend getting a copy of this when you finish Mistborn 3, and as soon as you're done with Mistborn 3, go read The 11th Metal. It's a short story set in the Mistborn world. It doesn't really spoil anything for the first trilogy, so it's good to read. This is where things might get divisive. I would say after reading The 11th Metal, you should read the short story Mistborn Secret History. This short story does have it's not a slight spoiler, it does have a spoiler for Mistborn Era 2. Mistborn is going to be a really long series, extended wise. It's got a trilogy to start, and then it's got 4 books that happen a couple hundred years later. It does happen in the same world, there are some things that are consistent between the two. It's basically just like, if you moved the timeline forward and told another story in that world. It has spoilers for the 3rd book in the 4-book run that is in Era 2, but the spoilers aren't earth-shattering to me. The spoiler is a bigger thing for the world of Mistborn Era 1 than it is for Era 2. For Era 2, there are a lot of things that are revealed in that 3rd book. That's not a spoiler, I'm not telling you what any of them are, but the one that is in Mistborn Secret History is not that huge compared to some of the other ones, in my opinion. So if you really don't want anything spoiled, you want to approach it later, read it after Book 3 of Era 2 of Mistborn, which we'll get to that later. I wish I would have read it after Mistborn 3 because it would have been fresher in my mind and it would have hit way harder. It's incredible. It's a really good short story. So we have Mistborn Era 1, the first 3 books, the first short story, and then Secret History. From there, I'd move on to Warbreaker. Warbreaker is a standalone novel. It is apparently getting a sequel, but it's a standalone novel in the Cosmere right now. It has my all-time favorite Cosmere character, Lightsong. I just think he's super fun. You'll see if you read it. He's really cool. I think he's a hell of a guy. And the story is crazy. I don't even know where to start with summarizing it. Warbreaker is the story of 2 sisters who are princesses, and one of them is supposed to go marry this guy who's a king, and the other one... It's really complicated. I don't want to spoil anything, so I'm being very careful, but it has really interesting character development, and the big thing is that you need to read Warbreaker before you get into the Stormlight Archive. I'm not going to tell you exactly why, but you need to be familiar with some things. Warbreaker also, I think, is my favorite Cosmere book. It's kind of fun, it's very vibrant, like the magic system. I forgot to mention this with Mistborn. Each story set, let's say, has 1 or more magic systems that are part of that world that exists. So Mistborn, you get thrown into it, you see very quickly that magic system is allomancy. In Warbreaker, the magic system is based on color and breath, and I won't get into it more than that, but it is so beautiful to read because with a visually intriguing magic system, you get these incredible visuals in the book. So Warbreaker occupies a great position in the Cosmere. You don't need to know that much about the Cosmere itself to appreciate it. You could read it first, hypothetically. I think Mistborn is a stronger intro. From there, I would go directly into Elantris. Elantris is the first book that Brandon Sanderson got published. I think the early nature of it in his career shows in the book. It's a little slower than some of the other books that you read up to this point. The character development, I think, is a little bit less strong than Mistborn or Warbreaker, but it's really, really good. It's really cool. The magic system is crazy. There's kind of this divine sickness that takes this prince, and there was a princess that was supposed to go marry him. She doesn't get to because he's apparently dead. There's a really interesting plot about this foreign religion that wants to take over the world, and the interplay between that and this divine sickness. And the princess is really cool. She's awesome. This book is incredible. It's really good, but I recommend reading it third between Mistborn, Warbreaker, then Elantris, because it's not quite as strong as the other projects in my opinion, especially with pacing. So it takes a little bit longer to get into it, and you'll want to read it when you're already invested in this whole universe. After reading Elantris, you can move on to The Hope of Elantris, which is a short story. It's really, really cute. Very, very sweet short story. Then you can move on to The Emperor's Soul. The Emperor's Soul is a novella. It's almost a full book, but it's shorter. That is really freaking good. It takes place on the same world as Elantris, but there's a lot of differences. It's just incredible. So I would go, again, these are in Arcanum Unbounded, Elantris, Hope of Elantris, Emperor's Soul. So that covers sort of the first wave of Brandon Sanderson. You could read White Sand as well. I think the omnibus is coming out soon. White Sand is a series of graphic novels. So I'm holding off on White Sand. I don't feel like I'm missing out too much yet. I really want to read it. There's a lot of important stuff there, but I'm leaving it for now. It's not essential at this point. At this point, you get to have a little fun too, because there are more short stories in Arcanum Unbounded that you can go for right now if that's what you want to do. You could save these and read them later. I read them right away because I wanted to take a little break before getting into the beasts that are in the second wave of the Cosmere. So these short stories would be Shadows for Silence, which I think has a longer name, but Shadows for Silence, and Six of the Dusk. These are both incredible. They give you insight into the broader universe of the Cosmere and what it's like and the way things work a little bit. The beautiful thing about Sanderson is that there are some Easter eggs that pop up in each of these stories. There are some consistencies, there are plot elements and magical elements that are consistent across them. You only start to realize the shape of those things as you progress through reading more of the books. And at this point, if you've read the Mistborn trilogy to start, Warbreaker, Elantris, and then these short stories, you'll have a very basic idea of what's going on. You cannot read too much into Arcanum Unbounded because you'll spoil things if you're not careful with where you flip, so use the glossary. But you'll have a really interesting balance between not knowing a lot of things and knowing some things and being very excited for what comes next. This is where I personally made a mistake in my reading order. I jumped directly from reading all of that into Mistborn Era 2. I wish I would have done Stormlight Archive first. Stormlight Archive is going to be 10 books eventually. It's 2 5-book arcs and they're all big books. So I was like, I'll wait, those are intimidating, I'll wait, and I'll do Mistborn Era 2 first. Mistborn Era 2 is really, really good. The only thing is, I wish I knew some things from the Stormlight Archive before I knew some things from Mistborn Era 2. They're not really spoilers, but I have a more complete picture of what's going on in the Cosmere thanks to Mistborn Era 2 that I would have not wanted to have, potentially, if I was reading Stormlight again, starting over. So being a little bit more clueless going into Stormlight would have been maybe a little bit more like, my mind is getting blown, this is so crazy. The way it stands, it's still extraordinary, the stories are amazing, but I do think I would have done Stormlight first. So that's going to see you get into the Way of Kings, and then Words of Radiance, then there's a short story called Edge Dancer, I think that's actually a novella, then Oathbringer, a full-length book, then Dawn Shard, and then Rhythm of War. Book 5 of Stormlight is set to come out in 2024, so if you're starting this now, you're starting at the perfect time. So if you finish those 4 and Book 5 is not out, go ahead and move on to Mistborn Era 2. If Book 5 is out, jump into it. At this point, Mistborn Era 2 opens up to you and it's awesome. These stories are different from the original Mistborn. They're a little bit more focused in scale and the characters are very dynamic. The pacing is a bit quicker. They're not quite as long, but there are 4 of them. The characters are awesome. I think the cast of characters is really, really cool and well developed. For these, you have the Alloy of Law, followed by Allomancer Jack, which is a short story, then Shadows of Self, then The Bands of Mourning. This is the second place where you could read Mistborn Secret History. Again, I would do it earlier. And then you have The Lost Metal. Mistborn Era 2 gives you some, I don't want to say answers, it gives you some more insight into the world of Mistborn and the Cosmere as a whole. You really need to read everything in Wave 1 at least before getting into Mistborn Era 2. If you really want to get into Era 2 before Stormlight, it's fine. You're not going to miss anything crazy. Again, you might just have more of an understanding of the universe at large than you actually want at that point in time. Then we get into the secret projects. These are really cool and really exciting. I don't know anything about them. I refuse to read anything about them because I don't want to spoil them for myself. I just know they come at the very end of everything else. From there, we have everything that's coming out sooner or later, I guess. We have Mistborn Era 3, we have Mistborn Era 4, we have more Elantris books. I think it'll be a trilogy by the time it's done. We have the potential Warbreaker sequel. We have a second Mistborn Secret History apparently coming out. We have the entire second arc of Stormlight Archive. We have the Dragonsteel series. We have a lot of other things that I don't even want to get into because I don't know where they fit. I don't know where I want to put them. Suffice to say, you have a lot more wonderful things to read that are coming out in the future if you get engaged with this now. And again, I think Mistborn's a beautiful place to start because the first book could be a standalone if you want it to be. It's a satisfying ending. You could just leave it there. If you want it just to be the trilogy, you can just leave it there. But if you really like it and you want to open up into all these other things that this guy's written, you can go from there and just totally explore. So to summarize this, and again, being very careful, I'm sorry if I haven't told you enough about what goes on in each of these books. I don't want to spoil anything for you. Start off with Mistborn 1 through 3, and then the 2 short stories. Go to Warbreaker, go to Elantris, associated short stories, a couple more short stories, Stormlight Archive and the associated short stories, Mistborn Era 2 and the associated short stories, and then the secret projects. That should carry you through pretty much everything he's published up to this point. The only other thing, again, is the White Sand Omnibus comic book that I'm looking to pick up soon. I think it's coming out in the next few months. So when that comes out, I'm just gonna tear through it. Like, I'm gonna buy it and immediately read the whole thing in a day. Again, if you want to do this differently, you're not really missing out on anything. Like, the cool thing about this experience is if you have more knowledge or less knowledge for a certain series or a certain world that you're exploring, that's just gonna alter the experience slightly. If you want to know everything about the universe that is available, go read the entire Arcanum about it and then read everything else. If you want to explore it in a very piecewise fashion, if you want to go bit by bit, I would start the way that I started and outlined in this video. So there's no wrong way to do it, but if you want to go through it with a development of knowledge that is linear to an extent and makes sense and builds upon itself as you go, that is the exact order that I would approach this in. I think by the time that he's done with all of this, it's going to be an absolute masterpiece and like a must-read in the canon of fantasy and sci-fi literature. I hope that helps in your journey with reading these. If you're interested in reading Brandon Sanderson, I think approaching it with a little bit of a game plan in mind, with a roadmap, is the way to go for sure. In any event, thank you so much for being here. As always, happy reading.